Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. And let me start by apologizing again for missing the class yesterday. Unfortunately, I thought so. Basically, my dad had an eye operation, and so he couldn't really see. And then there was some issue at the hospital where they messed something up, and so I ended up having to take care of him for about a day or two. And although I thought that I could probably do that while teaching online, he needed too much help for me to be able to do that. So I ended up having to cancel the class after all. So sorry about that. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it was out of my hand, and the hospital just messed something up. Anyway, okay. So basically, what I want to do is, I mean, ideally, this class would have been, in person because then we would talk about the different components. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to quickly go through some of the reasons for and against rejecting any of these three premises that are not compatible with one another and which we talked about in the context of perception. And I'll just kind of introduce the issues for and against, and then we'll talk about them in class tomorrow, I guess. Okay, hopefully I'm going to try to make this as short as possible. This way you guys can watch it before tomorrow since that really matters. So I guess let's get started. Okay, so just remember, okay, we considered these three propositions, okay, which all of them individually seem plausible, but collectively seem inconsistent. By the way, I should say, there's going to be background noise because this city is a noisy city, so just please bear with it. Okay. So like I said, there's these three premises. Each of them seems alone plausible, but when you put them together, they're incompatible with one another. And so as a result, we have to reject at least one of them. And this gives us these various positions that we could have on the nature of perception. So remember here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to see how perception might be able to play the role that it plays in giving us knowledge, right? We are supposed to be able to, on the basis of hearing something, I know that there's a sound in the house, and on the basis of seeing something, that's proof that that thing is there. So we typically take perception to be evidence. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make sense of how perception can function as evidence, and specifically how it can function as evidence of an external world, so a world outside of our minds, right? That's what perception is supposed to show us. It's supposed to show us that we can encounter a reality outside of our minds. Okay, so let's recall these three premises that are supposed to all sound plausible on their own, but collectively are not compatible. So, by the way, I'll refer to this as Brewer's inconsistent triad. Brewer is the guy, Bill Brewer is the second reading that you guys have, and the inconsistent triad is this thing that he develops, these three premises that don't work together and which we're discussing. And it's a triad because it's made up of three statements, and it's inconsistent because these three statements are not compatible. So in this inconsistent triad, the three statements are, first, that the direct objects of perception are mind-dependent. And the idea here is that what we encounter when we perceive depends in some sense on our minds. The second issue we said, or the second statement we said, is that the physical objects are the direct objects of perception. So why do we say physical objects are direct objects of perception? Well, because remember, if perception is supposed to give us knowledge, it gives us knowledge of the external world, of the physical world. And so this is the world outside of our minds. And the idea is that when we perceive, that's what we learn. We learn things outside of our minds. So remember, perception is like seeing, hearing, and so on. Typically, you think that you don't just know things about yourself. You don't know just that you're in such and such state, or you're, happy or unhappy. You also know, for instance, that there are car horns outside, that there's a cup on to your side, that there's a computer screen in front of you, and so on. So you know things about the world around you. And this idea that physical objects are the direct objects of perception will help us to make sense of that. I guess I didn't really motivate the first statement, but I'll come back to that. So for the third statement says that physical objects are mind independent. and this just expresses a basic idea that we have, that things that are not in our minds, things like tables, cups, chairs, trees, rocks, sounds, right? These things are not mind dependent. Physical objects are not mind dependent. The world of physics is a world that would exist whether or not humans existed, right? So physical objects are mind independent. They're also the things that we encounter directly in perception. This is how perception is able to tell us about the external world. But at the same time, these objects that we perceive seem to depend on our minds. And so that's the first statement. So let me just I just kind of went through them backwards, but I'm just going to go through them in the order that you guys have them written out. And I would definitely highly recommend keeping them in front of you as we're doing this. So the three statements were: the direct objects of perception are mind dependent. The physical objects are the direct objects of perception, and physical objects are mind independent. And the three of these are not compatible because, let's go back to that first one, which we had skipped the justification for. So direct objects of perception are mind dependent. Why would we think this? Well, let's think about the reasons for accepting this statement. The first reason we saw is that, when we look at, for instance, a cube, we see three of these shapes. But of course, the cube is just one shape. So it looks like when we encounter the cube, we have a sort of appearance of the cube, or something that is subjective, something that depends on us. So that's one reason you might think this. You might just think that the cube, what we see in perception, or the direct objects of perception, are mind dependent because they partly depend on the perceiver who is looking at them. The reason I see that side, that look of the cube, or this look of the cube, or this third look of the cube, all depends on some features of my mind. Now, there's an even stronger reason to think about this, which some of you have brought up already in class, which is that you might think that two perceivers who look at the same object might nevertheless see different things. So maybe when I look at this red cube, I see a cube that looks red. But when the cat looks at the red cube, it doesn't see an object that looks red. Cat vision sees red much worse than us. So maybe it sees it as light pink. And of course, some animals don't see it at all, don't see these colors at all, or they might see different colors from us. In general, it just seems that different species can see the world in different ways. And if they can see the world in different ways, then what would explain this is that what we see depends on our minds in somehow. Because when I look at the cube, the thing that I encounter depends on my mind. I see it looking a particular way, but when the cat looks at the cube, what it encounters depends on its mind in some way, and so that's what explains why there's a difference between the way I see the cube and the way the cat sees the cube. But if that's so, then it looks like the direct objects of perception do depend on our minds. So that's another reason. So on the one hand, there's the variability of object appearances. That could suggest that the things that we encounter depend on our minds. They seem to depend, for instance, on the perspective through which we look at the object with. On the other hand, we can see that they're mind dependent because it seems like the appearance of an object will change depending on which species you are. We also saw the case of illusions. So remember, illusions are cases where an object looks to have properties that it in fact lacks. So for instance, the Zollner lines, so that's Zollner, the Zollner lines look like they're not parallel, but in fact they are parallel. So they seem to have the property of being non-parallel when in fact they have the property of being parallel. That's an illusory case. When an object that's white looks red to us, that looks like an illusory case. So there's all of these illusory cases, and these illusory cases also seem to suggest that maybe perception depends on our minds. After all, we would expect that if they didn't depend on our minds, we would expect, if the lines are not parallel, then they shouldn't look like they're parallel, or vice versa. If the lines are of equal length, they shouldn't look unequal. What explains the fact that they look unequal since they are equal? Well, one potential explanation of why they might look unequal or look non-parallel, even though the original lines are parallel or are equal, is that they, in some sense, depend on our minds. So that's another reason for accepting that first premise. And of course, there's the idea of hallucinations, right? Hallucinations are supposed to be cases where you see something that's not there. You might, either from staying up or from taking some drugs, right, imagine or hallucinate a red cube. And when you hallucinate that red cube, there really is no red cube. You're actually not seeing anything at all. Then that thing that you're seeing seems to not be there out in the world, but instead seems to, in some sense, depend on your minds. So illusions, hallucinations, the appearances of objects, and the variability of appearances across species, all of them count as reasons for accepting mind dependence and for maintaining this idea of mind dependence. Okay. Well, let's consider why we might want to accept directness. So right now, basically what I'm doing is I'm motivating each of these statements, and then we'll see, this way we'll have a better idea of what cost we're paying when we try to eliminate one of them. Because remember, we're going to have to eliminate one of them in the end. Okay, when it comes to directness, this idea that physical object, forget directness. When it comes to the second statement being that physical objects are the direct objects of perception. Well, we've already said that the direct objects of perception depend on our minds. But now we're considering this other idea, the idea that in perception, we encounter physical objects. Now, there's lots of reasons to believe that in perception we encounter physical objects. First, we tend to think that we live in one world, right? A physical world. This world objectively exists. It existed before you were born, and it's going to exist after you die. And this world, right, is the one that we all share, and we have an idea about this world, an idea of a world outside of our mind, so the idea of an external world. We seem to be able to talk about the external world. I can talk to you guys about this cup, and, then we're talking about something that's not me, nor is it you. It's something outside of both of us. We're able to know things about the cup. Well, what sorts of things can we know? Perception seems to give us two types of knowledge. For one example is that it gives us propositional knowledge, the knowledge we've been dealing with for the majority of the class. So for instance, I can, just from looking at the cup, and you guys, just from looking at the cup, can tell that there's a picture on the cup. You know that there is a picture on the cup, and you know that there is a picture on the cup from seeing a picture on the cup. Here, your knowledge is dependent on you seeing something. And this knowledge is about an external object, the cup, right? And you know a property of the cup because you're able to encounter that external object. It's not just propositional knowledge, though. It's not just that I can know that the cup is more than one color or not more than one color, or that it has a cat on it or it doesn't have a cat on it, or that it has a picture on it, doesn't have a picture on it. I can know something more. In perception gives us knowledge by acquaintance. Remember, we said that sometimes we know things like we know that the sky is blue, but also sometimes I just know you. Or I know redness because I've encountered redness. Well, in perception seems to give us acquaintance, right? It seems to acquaint us with objects because I am not only able to see that there is a picture on the cup, but in perception, I also encounter the cup itself. It's a direct encounter with the cup, and this is supposed to be acquaintance with an object outside of my mind, right? It's something that I've become introduced to through perception, and so now I know it through perception. Okay, so then I can know things through perception, that's knowledge by acquaintance, and I can know propositions from perception. So I can know that the cup is blue or whatever, right? So the difference would be knowing X versus knowing that X is F. Okay, so let's try to formalize these ideas, which all of them are ideas which try to support this claim that physical objects are the direct objects of perception. So on the one hand, why should we think this? Well, because we have an idea of an external world. We have this idea in our minds, right? We think that there's a world outside of our minds. But where would we get this idea from? Did we just construct it? Did we just make up the idea that there's a world outside of our minds? Well, typically we think that, no, we got this idea from somewhere. Well, one place we could have gotten it from is from our own experience. Our experience seems to show us things outside of our minds, and so as a result, we have an idea of things that exist outside of our minds. And so the idea of an external world comes to us from perception. And if so, then this suggests that perception is a direct encounter with a physical world or with physical objects. Okay. Second of all, I said that we're able to talk about this physical world. The fact that we can talk about it means that with our words, we manage to refer to something outside of our minds. Look, imagine that in perception, this thing is in your mind. The cup is in your mind. Well, then when you refer to it, so when you say that thing, right? So that's reference. This is called the demonstrative reference when you say this or that, but to refer is just to speak about something, right? So now imagine that you say that cup. If you're talking about something that's in your mind, then your statement, that cup, shouldn't mean anything to me. After all, you're talking about something that's in your mind, and I don't have access to your mind, so your reference, that cup, wouldn't mean something to me if the cup was not out here. But typically we think that we are able, with our demonstrative reference, when we say that cup, we don't refer to something in us, we refer to something out there in the physical material world. We seem to be referring to objects in the physical material world. When we point at the stars, we seem to be talking about the stars themselves. And these objects are objects of common reference. We can all refer to them. I can talk about the stars, you can talk about the stars, you can talk about the cup, I can talk about the cup. And in all cases, these things are outside of our minds. We manage to refer to them. So our capacity to refer to an external world, to say things about an external world, also seems to suggest that since the things that we refer to are the things that we see, hear, smell, touch, and so on, then it looks like physical objects are the direct objects of perception. It looks like perception just gives us an encounter with those things that are outside of us. Okay, so we have an idea of an external world, and that's best explained by perception giving us a connection to the physical objects, to these external physical objects. Second of all, that we are able to speak about an external world suggests that we're able to see that external world. And then finally, that we can have knowledge of the external world. So assuming we're not skeptics, typically, people think that you can know things about the world around you. And you can know things about the world around you, at least partly by perceiving them. Since we are able to know, for instance, that the sky is blue or that there's a cup on the desk, it looks like, and of course we can encounter, for instance, other people. You guys can know me, and you know me by seeing me, hearing me, and so on. So if we have this sort of external world knowledge, whether it's acquaintance knowledge or propositional knowledge, this also suggests that physical objects are the direct objects of perception. Okay, well, so much for these first two. So now we have some reasons to believe that the direct objects of perception are mind-dependent, and we also have some reason to believe that physical objects are the direct objects of perception. Uh, let's consider now the third statement, which says that physical objects are mind independent. Well, this idea that physical objects are mind independent is an idea that we basically get from, first our common sense understanding, but also our physics, right? The idea is that, you know, uh, are physical objects, the ones that physics talks about, dependent on anyone? We typically think the material world does not depend on anyone. It's a world that we are born into and that we can die from, right? But it continues to be there. There's a materiality to it. There's a materiality to it and a substantiality to it that has nothing to do with our minds. What our minds seem to do is they seem to reveal this world, but they don't seem to construct that world. When we look at the moon is just an object there, and this object there was there before any minds looked at it, and it might stay there after any minds look at it. The fact that a mind is able to encounter the moon doesn't mean that the moon itself has something to do with minds. Typically, that's the normal picture we derive from physics. So this is what we could call realism about the physical world, that we think that it does not depend on our minds. Okay, well, given that we think physics is like that, it seems plausible to say that physical objects are mind independent. And if so, then now each of these statements is motivated, but we can't accept each of these statements. Okay, so, I realize there's some of this is going to be a little bit of a recap for you guys. But now what I want to do is I want to try to consider these, and, this part will also be slightly a recap. But we're going to consider different ways in which we might reject one of these three premises and the sorts of reasons that we're going to give, but also the costs we're going to incur by doing this. So let's take this first statement. In fact, maybe I'll just pause this video for a second and get back to it because I don't want to. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, so let's consider denying each of these premises. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to do them in reverse because I think that it'll make more sense for the way the discussion goes. Okay. So let's start by trying to deny this idea that physical objects are mind independent. And look, see that if you deny this, you can solve the problem, because here's then what your view is. You're saying that you directly encounter these physical objects, okay? But the things that you directly encounter are mind dependent. So here's one solution. What if you could just say that physical objects themselves are mind dependent? To do this, you would have to deny the view that is commonly accepted in physics, namely the view that physical objects do not depend on our minds, right? But you might still be able to do that. Now, in fact, one position has done this, and this position is idealism. Idealism is the view that the material world does not really exist. In fact, what there really exists is experiences. Reality is not fundamentally made of physical objects, it's rather made of experiences. And there's kind of a simple argument for the view. The argument says this. It says, consider any physical object that you encounter. Well, that physical object is something that you experience. And, in fact, the idea of this physical object independently of your experience is not one that you have. So let's take a particular example. Imagine that you have a cup, right? Here's the cup, okay? And now this cup is supposed to be a physical object, but it's also something that you experience. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell me what this cup is like independently of your experience. If it's a physical object which is mind independent, then there's some way it is, with or without us experiencing it. But try to think of that thing. Well, probably you can't, right? All you find yourself thinking about is the cup as it is experienced. Think about the top of Mount Everest. When you think about it, You think of a particular, like rocky space with ice on it, with wind around it. But that's an experience, right? You can't even imagine something that is not experienced. The idealist argues that for us, when we think of the physical world, we always think about our experiences of the physical world. And we have no idea of a physical world that is independent of experiences. Any physical world we imagine is one which is experienced. So idealists think that common sense is wrong. Common sense tells us that there's a physical world outside of our minds, but when we come to think about what that world is supposed to be like or what it is, right, we have nothing to say. So they argue that, in fact, physical objects do depend on our minds. And this is because, ultimately, physical objects are not basic. What's basic is experiences of physical objects. There aren't really cups fundamentally in reality. There are rather experiences of cups fundamentally in reality. So, at bottom, right, reality is mind-dependent. Now, there's a lot of issues with this position and about how to try and make sense of if everything depends on your mind, well, then now think about some of these other issues I was talking about. Then why do we think we know something about a world outside of our minds? We don't have now an answer for that. Are we just wrong? According to the idealist, yeah, we just are. We're also not able to refer to things outside of our minds. We don't have knowledge of a world outside of our minds. Everything we have knowledge of, everything we refer to, is something in our minds. But this also means that there's your mind and there's my mind. What's the connection between the cup experienced by you and the cup experienced by me? If there isn't a unifying cup, which is the thing that is experienced in both cases, if there's just fundamentally these experiences, what's at the bottommost level? We talk about this in class so basically what I want to do is my hope is that you guys will try to kind of push us towards, considering each of these options in more detail. So it's about the defenses that you guys will offer. But here I just want to give you like a background picture. So then one way of answering this problem, the problem we're facing with perception, is to adopt idealism. Idealism is the view that physical objects are mind-dependent because fundamentally they're experiences of a certain sort. If we say this, then we get to keep like a pretty nice picture. We get to say, no, we really do encounter the physical world, right? So we do know things about the world that we typically call the physical world. And we know this stuff about it directly, right? So we accept that the direct objects, that physical objects are the direct objects of perception, and simultaneously we accept that the direct objects of perception are mind-dependent. But what we do is that we equate mind-dependent objects with physical objects. And so we deny the standard physical picture, which says that physical objects are mind-independent. This gives us a view in which we directly encounter physical objects, but we've altered the nature of these physical objects. We've said that they're mind-dependent. Okay, that's one way we could go. So that's by rejecting the third of these three claims. But we might think that this is too much of a cost to pay. Not only do we need to talk about whether idealism is coherent at other levels, right? But also we might think that it's too much to try and revise the picture that physics offers us of the physical world. Physics says the physical world is mind-independent, and although there are some views in physics that do say it's mind-dependent, maybe some ways of understanding quantum mechanics, right? Nevertheless, the standard position is that reality does not depend on our minds. So you might think that that's too costly to eliminate that premise, and so we should eliminate one of the other premises. So let's consider the other premises, okay? Maybe we can try to eliminate this idea that physical objects are the direct objects of perception. So we've already kind of talked about this, and in fact, we've seen that to a certain extent, Descartes seems to have something like this in mind, but also Russell seems to have this sort of picture in mind. When he says we see, for instance, the table, but then the table is one shape, but the experiences of the table, give us three different shapes, then this means that these sense data are not the same thing as the physical object. Russell thinks that we see physical objects by experiencing these sense data, and so we sense the sense data, and by sensing the sense data, we then produce a link between the sense data and the physical object, and that's, how we encounter physical objects. As you guys can see, this claim is that physical objects are not the direct objects of perception, not because they're not physical and not because they're not any objects of perception, but because they're not the direct objects of perception. We rather encounter the physical world indirectly. We encounter it by encountering something else. In this sense, perception is a bit like looking at a picture. When you look at a picture, if I look at a picture of my cat, I don't see my cat directly. I see it indirectly. I see it by seeing the surface of the picture. Similarly here, the claim is something like this, that when I see the cup, I don't see the cup itself. I rather see some of the sense data, this data that my senses receive. And by seeing the data that my senses receive, I am somehow able to know about the cup itself. This position, because it maintains that we encounter the physical world and that the physical world is mind independent, is a type of realism, right? So usually we distinguish between realism and idealism. Idealism will say that reality exists, but it exists mind dependently, whereas realism says that reality exists, but exists mind independently. Since this view that we're talking about now, and like Russell's sense data view, accept that there is a physical world and that this physical world is mind independent, they're a form of realism. But since they deny that we encounter the physical world directly, they're what we would call an indirect realism. So then by denying the second statement, we would be accepting a position called indirect realism. Instead of ending up with idealism, we end up with indirect realism. And now indirect realism says that physical objects are not the direct objects of perception. Instead, they're indirect objects of perception. We encounter them by encountering something else. Well, what else? For instance, these appearances. When we looked at the cube and the cube had three different shapes, what we encountered is those three different shapes, which are different from the cube itself. They are appearances of the cube or looks that the cube has. And so maybe it's by encountering them that we encounter the cube. And so now we have a sort of indirect, or a view we call indirect realism. Now, I want you to now think about it from an epistemological point of view, right? So what does this tell us about, our knowledge of the world, our capacity to refer to the world, our idea of an external world, and so on? Remember that we were accepting that physical objects are the direct objects of perception because we were saying that we have an idea of an external world, that we're able to refer to the world, and we're able to have knowledge of the world. Can we still refer to the world, know things about the world, and have an idea of an external world if we accept that we actually encounter physical objects indirectly? Well, let's think about it. Okay, so instead of seeing the cube itself, what I end up seeing is the appearance of the cube. Well, now let's think about so if all we encounter in perception are appearances, then shouldn't perception give us an idea of an apparent world rather than giving us an idea of an external world? If these appearances are things that do depend on our minds, right? Because now we can accept the first statement, the direct objects of perception are mind dependent, and that physical objects, but we, of the three statements, we accept the first one, which says the direct objects of perception are mind dependent. So whatever it is that we're directly seeing depends on our minds. We also accept that physical objects are mind independent. So they're not the things that we're directly seeing, they're something else. So now these things that do depend on our minds, the looks or the appearances of the cube, okay, these are the things that we encounter in perception. And if these things depend on our minds, then now you might ask, how do we have an idea of an external world that does not depend on our minds? We certainly can't seem to have this idea from perception. Perception only directly relates us to things that are mind dependent, so it should give us ideas of those things. We can see why perception gives us an idea of a cube's looks, but why should it give us an idea of a cube? After all we encounter are cube looks, since we only encounter the cube indirectly. Well, maybe we can try to run an argument of this sort. We could say, if S sees something that looks this way, it has three appearances, then that thing is a cube. S sees something that looks this way, so that thing is a cube. So now we run an argument. The argument has this form. It says, if S sees appearances A, then S is related to an object O. S sees the appearances A, therefore S is related to the object O. So now I see three appearances of the cube, and when I see three appearances of the cube, it means there is a cube. And I do see three appearances of the cube, so there is a cube. Okay, well, we might try to run an argument of this sort, but I want you now to think about the first premise. The first premise says that when you see appearances that look like this, that means there's an object that looks like that. Well, but how would you know this? It's not like you get to look at both of them. You always see the appearances. You never see the cube itself. So how would you form an association between things looking this way and things being this way? You never encounter the way things are, the way they are in their being. You only encounter them in their looks. And since you only encounter them in the looks, then it's mysterious how you would be able to link those looks with that object. Anyway, we'll talk about this problem some more. But at the very least, it seems like there's something weird going on, because if all I encounter are these mind-dependent appearances, then it's mysterious why I should have ideas about a world beyond these appearances. It seems like the idea I should have is the idea of the appearances only. I thought about a way of putting it which might be helpful for you guys. So think about, go back to another case of indirect perception, which is the perception of a picture. Imagine that I take a photograph of you on my iPad, and so now I see you by seeing this photograph. Well, if perception is like that, then it's like I'm always looking at photographs. And so it looks like perception should be able to give me an idea of photographs, since that's all I ever see. But it will be mysterious why it should give me an idea of you, who is outside the photograph. When I perceive, I only see a picture of you, not you. So then it looks like perception should only give me ideas of pictures of you, never ideas of you. Unless we're going to argue that there's some special link between the picture of you and you. But now we'll have to talk about what this link will amount to. Anyway, we can worry about this later. Take now this idea of reference. We said we're able to refer to the external world. We're able to refer to cups, cubes, trees, clouds, and so on. And we're able to refer to them by, for instance, seeing them. So then, if that's the case, let's see if we can still do that if we accept an indirect realistic view of perception. According to this view, I don't see the clouds, I see the appearance of the clouds. So now when I say those things, what am I referring to? Am I referring to the clouds, or am I referring to the appearances? Well, according to this view, I have to be referring to the appearances. Once again, think about this is the look of, so in the picture perception case, I see you by seeing a picture of you. That's a bit like the relationship of seeing the object by seeing the appearance of the object. Well, if every time I see clouds, I see it by seeing the looks of the clouds, then when I say those clouds, I don't refer to the clouds, I refer to the cloud looks. So now it looks like I should only be able to refer to cloud looks or to cube looks or cube appearances, but not to cubes and so on. Unless maybe I refer indirectly. After all, I can refer to you in the picture by referring to a picture. I can say that guy, meaning, well, now it's a little ambiguous. Is it that guy, the guy I see in the picture, the small one, right? Or is it you yourself, the person who this is based on? We might be able to say that we indirectly refer, but we would have to kind of think about whether that really is a possibility. Okay, so now think about external world knowledge, right? And remember we said that we know things about the external world in two ways. We know either by acquaintance or propositionally, so I can from perception know you, or know the rose, or I can know that the rose is red or that you are tall. So now if we only encounter looks in perception and only encounter the other things indirectly, can we know things about, the external world? And what sorts of things can we know? Well, again, it looks like our knowledge should be constrained to the looks of things. How would we be able to know things about the way things are if all we encounter directly in perception is the way things look? I should be able to form an acquaintance relationship with the look of something or with the sense data of something, right? But not with the thing itself. I never encountered the thing in perception. I always encountered the sense data of the thing, the appearance of the thing, the look of the thing, etc. Imagine that I say, the rose is red. It doesn't look like I can talk about the rose. I can say the look of the rose is red. And that's right, since I encountered looks in perception. But can I say that the rose is red? And in fact, how would I go about knowing that? It looks like now my external world knowledge is limited to knowing those appearances. Now, again, we can try to build a step from the appearances to the real world, but there's a question mark about how we're going to know what's that link. Since we never encounter one of the two entities, then maybe there's a gap in that link. Now, Descartes thought we can actually build this link. I'll talk about that in class next time. And there's many indirect realist positions that try to give an account of this link. But as you guys might be able to tell from the Russell reading, one worry is that once you get here, you might start to worry whether there really is a link. Now, if you deny that there's a link and you deny everything outside of that, if you deny that we can know it, even if it exists, then you've become a skeptic. You're saying perception only gives us knowledge of appearances, never of reality, but there might be still a reality. If you say that actually perception only gives us knowledge of appearances, but the connection is not there and there's nothing outside of that, then now you've become an idealist, because now you're saying perception only gives us a relationship to appearances, but there's nothing beyond the appearances, so everything is mind dependent. And so that moves you to an idealist picture. The indirect realist needs to make sure they don't collapse in these ways. They can't become skeptics. They have to still give us a link to the ultimate physical object, and they can't become idealists, so they can't deny that there's really a physical object. So in other words, they are burdened with explaining to us, how is it that we manage to see one thing by seeing another? How do I manage to see the cube by seeing the three appearances of the cube? Okay, so from here, let's move to the denial of the first premise. So now I've considered what it would cost us to deny the idea that physical objects are mind independent, and what it would cost us to deny that physical objects are the direct objects of perception. So let's say we would like to keep those two. What would it cost us to reject the direct objects of perception are mind dependent? Okay, so on this view, what we want to say is that we want to maintain that physical objects are mind independent, and we want to maintain that we directly encounter those physical objects. What we're instead going to deny is that the things that we encounter are mind dependent. Well, you can immediately see that there's a bunch of challenges for this denial. After all, there were lots of reasons for accepting that the direct objects of perception are mind dependent. First of all, there was the subjectivity of appearances. We also saw, the first thing we saw is that there's these multiple appearances, which are subjective appearances, of the cube, for instance. But we also saw that, different species might see the same thing differently. We also saw the case of illusions. We also saw the case of hallucinations. So if we're going to deny that the direct objects of perception are mind dependent, we basically have to say, we have to explain how illusions, hallucinations, and appearances are possible without saying they depend on our minds. That seems like a tall order, but let's try and see what they could say. So here's one thing we can start by doing. We can start by thinking a little bit more carefully about this idea of appearances and about whether and in what sense these appearances depend on our minds. So, in fact, one way to try and sort the problem of, there being multiple appearances and also the problem of different species that seeing different appearances for an object is to distinguish between two ways in which appearances might be mind dependent. Basically, what we're going to argue is that there's two ways in which appearances can be mind dependent, but only one of them is really mind dependent. The other one is not quite mind dependent. And so, since there isn't the mind dependence which is problematic, we can get rid of this premise without a problem. That's formally what we're going to do. Let's try and do it. So, look, imagine that I want to give you an example. Actually, maybe I'll pause the video for a second because it's starting to get long, and I'll think of a nice example and come back. Okay, so think about now mind dependence, okay? Here's one thing that could be happening. Let's concentrate on a particular case, but I'll then import it or export it to the next case. Think about the case where I look at the cube and the cat looks at the cube, and we both see different appearances. Well, here's one thing that could be happening. It could be that we both receive light signals, so the light bounces off the surface of the cube, hits our eyes, hits my eyes, hits the cat's eyes, okay? And now they get the sense data, right? And now here's what your brain could do. It could take the sense data, which is like raw material. It then crushes it, fixes it up, whatever, right? And then constructs an image for you, the image of a red cube for you human, right? And for your cat, a grayish cube. And so now it's got a grayish cube, you've got this red cube. And this thing, the image that you're seeing, the appearance, is something constructed by your brains. Now, of course, on this picture, mind dependence really means that it depends on your mind. It means that even if you got rid of the cube, you could still, as long as you got that raw material, your brain could crush it, do whatever it is, and then give you that nice image that you end up getting. In which case, we would really want to say that the direct objects of perception are mind dependent, because they do now depend on your mind. They're literally constructed by your mind. But think about a different picture. Here's this picture. Now, the cube in front of me, okay, let's try a different example because it'll make things a little bit clearer. We're still going to be looking at an object, okay? And now here's what we're going to say. We're going to say it's let's call it a sphere, and it's a sphere that's half red and half green, okay? Now, here's the thing. Imagine two creatures. One creature who their vision is able to detect the color red in objects, but it's not able to detect the color green. When there are green things out there in the world, the green things just don't look anyway at all, and so they're just transparent to this creature. So this creature is able to detect redness in objects, but not greenness in objects. When there are green things in objects, they just don't show up to it in any way whatsoever. The other creature that we have has the opposite problem, right? They have vision that's able to detect the color green, but not the color red. So for them, when there are green things in the environment, those green things look green to them. But when there are red things in the environment, those things don't look anyway at all. So you can pretend that those things, when there are red things in the world for both of them, for one of them, and green things for the other one, those things are either transparent, or you can pretend that they're white, for instance. So they just don't detect those things. Compare this to you and infrared vision, okay? You don't see infrared in the world. You see red, but you don't see what's past red. You see, the spectrum of colors, and you don't see what's outside of it. When there are infrared in your surroundings, they just look transparent to you. So even if right now there was a lot of infrared, and here it was a little redder than here in infrared, to you it just looks all transparent. So now think about these two creatures, one of which has red detectors, one of which has green detectors. When both of them look at the same sphere, remember this sphere is half red, half green. So when one of them looks at it, it looks like this. It looks like half a sphere, and this half sphere is red. To the other creature, it looks like a half sphere, and the sphere is green. That half sphere is green. So both these creatures get different looks. For one of them, the sphere, which is red and green, looks like half a red sphere, and for the other creature, it looks like half a green sphere. The two different looks. But I want you to notice something about the way this case is mind-dependent. In some sense, the redness and the greenness, right, and the sphere itself are not in these creatures' minds. They're out there in the world. Right? These creatures are simply looking at the world. It's just that they can detect different amounts of what they're looking at. One creature is only able to detect the red stuff in its surroundings. The other one's only able to detect the green stuff in its surroundings. How much it can detect depends on its mind. But the object it's detecting does not depend on its mind. The sphere is out there, right? So on this picture, rather than say that the appearances of the object are things that are constructed by the mind, the appearances of the object are the result of selecting some parts of what is out there. And so, on this view, rather than think about your mind as constructing out of raw material an image, it instead filters the raw material so that you get an image. The image that you get depends partly on the filtering process, but it also partly depends on what's going on out there. In this case, although you could in some sense say, the appearance is mind dependent, it's not mind dependent in the sense that it's in your mind. It's mind dependent in the sense that how much of what is out there, which doesn't depend on your mind, can be seen by you. In this case, I can explain the difference between me and the cat. What I can say is that I have red detectors, and so I detect the red parts of the world. My cat doesn't have red detectors, so it detects those red parts of the world. It fails to detect those red parts of the world. It has instead some other detectors, and so it detects the things that it gets with those other detectors. We're all seeing the mind-independent world, and appearances really do depend on the objects themselves, not on our minds. But our minds do pick out or select some parts of the world. So you can now think about these two different models, okay? One model says that perception is generative. So perception generates a perceptual image or an appearance, and so we can say perception is generative. The other view says that perception is selectionist. Perception selects features of the outside world, even if it selects them in different ways and to different extents. Still, it is just a selection of the world. It's not generating the things that you see, it's simply selecting from what's out there. If we're able to give this sort of distinction, well, now we can try to deny the direct objects of perception are mind-dependent by saying that, in fact, the fact that the cube can look three different ways and that me and the cat see things differently doesn't have to do with these appearances depending on my mind in the sense that they're being generated by my mind. Rather, they depend on my mind in the sense that I'm selecting different features of the outside world. So, in fact, the direct objects of perception are mind independent because the direct objects of perception are those objects in the outside world. It's just that I select some of them but not others depending on the case. Okay, now there's responses that we can give to this sort of argument, but let's move on because I want to just get to the end of this and then hopefully we'll talk more about it in class. Remember, we don't just have the problem of subjective appearances and differences in cross-species appearances, but also we have the problems of illusion and the problems of hallucination. Those problems, right, are going to, in a way, produce even more difficulties because now notice that well, let's see what we can say. Remember, we've made the distinction between generative accounts of perception and selectionist accounts of perception. So let's see if we can use this distinction to account for illusions and hallucinations. Could we say in an illusion that in the illusion we select parts of the world and this is what makes the object illusory? Of course, if we're going to say we select parts of the world, then this implies that those parts of the world are there. So remember that, for instance, the sphere was both red and green, and that's why we were able to select one of the two. So now, could we really say that, for instance, the Zollner lines or the Muller-Lyer lines, both of these are types of illusions, in the Muller-Lyer lines, the lines are equal length, but they look unequal in length, and in the Zollner lines, they're parallel, but they don't look parallel. Could we say we're selecting non-parallelity from the parallel lines? Or could we say we're selecting non-equality from the equal lines? Well, it's a little bit unclear because do parallel lines contain non-parallelness in them? And do equal lines contain unequal lines in them? It seems like I can't be selecting something that's not there. And in an illusion, when I see the lines being unequal, there is no inequality there. If you measured them, they would look equal. You could draw them yourself and they would look equal. Any attempt at thinking about them shows them as equal, except that you don't see them as equal, you see them as unequal. But the inequality doesn't seem to be there. So it looks like I can't be selecting inequality from the equal lines. So now this distinction between generative and selectionist is not necessarily doesn't look like it's going to work, at least immediately, for illusions. Why is that? Well, notice that illusions are more than just weird appearances, So remember, the cube could have three different appearances, and that was puzzling to us. But illusions are doing something more than that. They're not just showing us appearances, they're showing us misleading appearances that seem to indicate something that isn't there. The appearance of unequal lines, when you see an appearance of the cube, it just seems to be of the cube. But when you see an appearance of unequal lines, it's not just of unequal lines. In the illusion, it's of equal lines, and that's what's so puzzling. So the problem isn't just appearances, but misleading appearances. Those don't seem to be easily solved by just making the distinction between generative and selectionist. It seems like we're encountering properties that are not there in the outside world, and so these look like they must be constructed in our minds since they're not out there, right? Well, that's illusions, but what about hallucinations? In some sense, the hallucinations make the problem even worse, because if you're going to say that you're selecting parts of the world, the question is which parts are you selecting when you hallucinate the pink elephant in the classroom? If you've stayed up for many nights before you come to class, maybe because you had a test, and now you're sitting in class and you're dozing off as I speak, and now you hallucinate a pink elephant in the room, according to selectionism, you have to be selecting some parts of your surroundings. But what parts of your surroundings are you selecting? I mean, the things that are around you are not pink, and you're in a classroom. There are no elephants in a classroom. There's neither pinkness nor elephantness, so you can't be selecting something that's out there. What you seem to be encountering is something that you've constructed in your mind. If illusions show us that there are properties that are not out there but which we experience, hallucinations seem to show us that there are objects that are not out there but that we've constructed. So to try and deny that the direct objects of perception are mind dependent is kind of difficult in the face of illusions and hallucinations. Well, here's one potential solution, and I mean, we'll talk about this more in class. We'll talk about all of this more in class. So I'll only consider one last solution. Here's what we could say about illusions and hallucinations. We could point out the following. We could say, yeah, okay, but wait, why are we talking in this way? Notice that I've been switching in a way, like without noting to you guys, that I start by talking about seeing a cube. And then I talk about having the illusion, which is seeing the Muller-Lyer lines. And then I talk about hallucinating a pink elephant. And then I act as if all three of these somehow belong together: perception, illusion, and hallucination. But why would you think they belong together? Why don't you say each of them has its own thing? Yeah, perception does not depend on our minds. It's a direct encounter with the world, even if it's a filtered encounter with the world. But in illusion, something else goes on, and in hallucination, something else goes on. Illusions might have a relation to mind-dependent objects, and hallucinations might have relations to mind-dependent objects, but perception doesn't. Perception is different from the other two. That's what makes it the good case, and those guys are the bad cases. You don't think you can gain knowledge about the length of lines if everything is an illusion, because then you would always be misled. And you don't think that you know anything about what's happening in the world if you're hallucinating, because you're hallucinating. But when you're seeing the world, no, you're getting it correct. And so maybe one option is to just try to separate these cases, to say illusions and hallucinations are mind-dependent, but perception is not. Well, to do this, you would have to say that the account of perception and the account of illusion and the account of hallucination are independent, or at least that illusions and hallucinations will not affect what we should say about perception, and perception shouldn't affect what we say about these cases. These two cases can be given separate accounts. Now, although this is a potential strategy, and this strategy, so let me just tell you, the strategy is called disjunctivism. Disjunctivism is the view that perceptual experience, these experiences that we think of as perceptual, right, like illusions, perceptions, and hallucinations, should not be construed as one thing. Instead, we should give multiple accounts. We can say that when I have a perceptual experience, either I perceive something, either I see it, hear it, smell it, and so on, or else I suffer from an illusion and or hallucination. And so it's disjunctive because a disjunction is like an either or. And so disjunctivism is just the fact that this account says either perception happens or one of these bad things happens, illusions or hallucinations. So that's what we could do. We could accept this sort of view, and then we would be able to say that the direct objects of perception are not mind dependent, so they're mind independent, but we would still admit that illusions and hallucinations are mind dependent. That's a potential option. Now, there are some problems, though, with saying this. One reason we had been connecting all three of these is that all three experiences can look alike. So in other words, if I see unequal lines, and if I have an illusion of unequal lines, and if I hallucinate unequal lines, these three cases can be indistinguishable from one another. So in other words, imagine that you walk into a room and somebody shows you, they tell you, okay, I'm going to do something, okay? So they give you something, they make you eat a pill of some sort, right? Simultaneously, they tell you, okay, we're going to now show you a piece of paper. And now you walk in and you see a piece of paper, and on this piece of paper you see unequal lines. And now they ask you, okay, are you seeing unequal lines? Or is this an illusion that we've constructed and you're seeing the illusion? Or is the pill that we gave you a hallucinogen and it's making you hallucinate those lines? Well, if you think about it really, really hard, that might not help, right? It might be that you just have to measure the lines for you to be able to tell if they're there, or you have to wait a little bit to see if this drug wears off and the lines disappear. From the inside, all three experiences look exactly alike. We've seen something like this. It's like whether we're in the real world or in the evil demon's world or in a dream, all three experiences look exactly the same to us. In all of them, it seems like it's real. If these experiences cannot be told apart from one another, then why think that these experiences, which can't be told apart from one another, are of different kinds? It looks like they're of the same kind. And if they're of the same kind, then it looks like we should give them one account. We can't adopt something like disjunctivism that says, oh, these ones are mind independent, these ones are mind dependent. So one reason to deny that we can just separate our accounts is to say that the accounts need to be unified, and the reason they need to be unified is because those experiences can't be told apart. Here, the fact that these experiences can't be told apart shows us that they share something in common, and what they share in common prevents us from saying that these ones are like this and these ones are like that. There must be something, a common factor to all of them. And that's the common factor is what explains to us why things seem to us the same way in all three cases. Notice that the indirect realist could account for this. They can say, in the perception case, you see some cube sense data. In the illusion case, you see some unequal line sense data. In the hallucination case, you see elephant sense data. What's common to all three is that you see sense data. But what differs across all three is that in one case, you see sense data and there really is a cube there. In the other case, you see sense data, but the sense data and the object that's there, the equal lines, are slightly different. And in the third case, the thing that's there and the elephant are totally discrepant. You have some sense data of an elephant, but there's no elephant there. Okay. I kind of went through all of these kind of quickly, and I do realize for those of you who are in perception that there's some repetition, but hopefully this is okay. We'll talk more about, the different solutions and different ways that we can go, but hopefully now you can see that we have like three basic positions, right? We can accept idealism, which denies the third premise in Brewer's inconsistent triad. We can accept indirect realism, which denies the second premise in Brewer's inconsistent triad, or we can accept, or we can reject the first premise and so solve Brewer's triad. So if we reject the first premise, the view that we end up with is that we are directly related to physical objects. Well, since it says there is physical objects and these physical objects are mind independent, this is also a form of realism. But since this form of realism doesn't say we indirectly encounter physical objects, then it's a direct form of realism. So now we have three positions: direct realism, indirect realism, and idealism. Okay, we'll talk about these positions some more in tomorrow's class, and hopefully I'll be able to upload this quickly. Okay, cheers, guys.